Petroleum is a resource that we use a lot in our everyday lives. It's used in the fuels we use for our cars, airplanes, motorcycles, and other vehicles. It's also found in many plastic products and a lot of other countless products that we use all the time. A lot of people know that comes from fossil fuels, but what they might think is that this means it comes from the dinosaurs. This isn't exactly true. A lot of the petroleum that is formed today comes from sea life, and especially plants and small organisms that lived millions and millions of years ago in the Earth's oceans. Now, to give a basic overview of how this works, millions and millions of years ago, all these sea plants and sea animals died, and their remains sunk down to the ocean floor. And over time, they were covered by layers of different sediments. And over millions of years, these sediments would layer upon each other and on top of the remains and would go deeper and deeper beneath the surface. And a lot of heat and pressure would turn the remains of these organisms into liquid oil and into natural gas. And then the oil and gas would rise up towards the surface and form reservoirs underground, which we can now access through drilling. Now that we've gone over the basic overview, let's go more into the specifics. So like I said before, millions of years ago, a lot of plants and other organisms died and sank to the seabed. A lot of these animals and sea plants were from the Mesozoic era. During this time, the time of the dinosaurs, the Earth's climate was rather warm. There are a lot of tropical locations around the Earth, and in the tropical seas, like any tropical place, there was a large amount of life and a large diversity of life. So when all these creatures and other organisms died, their remains floated to the bottom and became a good potential for forming petroleum reservoirs. Now what happens is the decaying matter will form, and it will begin to be covered by mud and other sediments and go further and further into the surface. But before this happens, during the decomposition process, bacteria will use up all of the elements such as oxygen and nitrogen and other trace elements in the remains and leave behind carbon and hydrogen, which form together to create hydrocarbons, which are what petroleum, oil, and other natural gases are. They're hydrocarbons. And so this organic material that's left over will be covered by layers of different sediments, and it will mix with the sediments to form this mass called keratin. Now, over millions of years, heat and pressure will convert the hydrocarbons in the keratin to liquid. Now, at about 10,000 feet below the surface and deeper is when the heat from the Earth's center will begin to heat up the hydrocarbons inside the keratin and create liquid petroleum. So now we have oil, but where does it go? The oil, because it is denser than all the rock and sediment on top of it, will begin to move through the rock layers. Plate tectonics are another thing that helps get the oil up towards the surface. The movement of the plates creates creates overlap with the layers of sediment, and it also shifts around the sediment so that gaps and holes start to occur for the oil to escape towards the surface through the rock layers. Now, as the oil and the gas approach the surface, one of two things can happen. The most common thing is for the oil and gas to move up through porous rock, and it'll keep going and going until it reaches a layer of impermeable rock, and this impermeable rock will cap off the movement of the oil and gas, and this is where reservoirs begin to form. And in these reservoirs, we get three layers. We get a layer of water because it is the most dense. Then we have a layer of oil above that, and then the layer of natural gas above that. The other thing that can occur is that an impermeable rock layer doesn't impede the movement of the oil and gas at all, and it'll continue to the surface and form a natural oil spring. Now these are really rare and only occur in several places around the Earth. Just a random fact to break up all this information. If you've ever wondered why the Middle East has so much oil, it's because millions and millions of years ago, the Persian Gulf once contained a large seaway that had a lot of tropical reefs in it, and so this gave a lot of plant life that died and could potentially turn into some oil deposits. And this combined with the fact that the ocean floor had a large lack of oxygen, it created the perfect conditions for oil formation. And so when the seaway closed after millions and millions of years, there began to form natural traps for these oil reservoirs to form. Now let's talk about oil reservoirs. So in order for an oil reservoir to form, there must be three different conditions met by the rocks involved. So we need to have the source rock, or the sediments at the bottom of the ocean, or under the Earth's surface. And they need to be rich with the hydrocarbons, which we get in the GEGN organic solid. And they need to be deep enough for the hydrocarbons to be converted from the solid to a liquid. Next, we have to have rock layers that are permeable for the oil to move through. And then we have to have that impermeable layer to cap the oil and gas and form the reservoir. Now, contrary to what you may imagine in your head, or what some people may think, oil doesn't pool up like an underground lake. Instead, what happens is we get tiny droplets of oil that cling to the rock on a massive scale, and this is how our reservoirs form, and they appear more like wet rocks instead of a pool of oil inside the rock. Now, there are several unconventional oil reservoirs that can form. Sometimes the sediment and the GEGN doesn't form into a liquid reservoir because it wasn't subject to enough heat and pressure. And so what happens is the GEGN will remain in the rocks and will turn into what is called oil shales. Now we can take the shales, extract them from the ground, and by putting them under a lot of heat and pressure, we're able to extract liquid oil from these shales. Another form of reservoir that can form is called a oil sand. And oil sands are a mix of tar, sand, clay, and silt and other sediments in a very dense mixture. And it's really hard to extract the oil from this because the mixture is just so heavy dense that it won't flow at all. And unless you heat it or dilute it with a lighter oil, you can't really extract the petroleum from this source. And once we get all these reservoirs formed, we're able to extract the resource and turn it into the products that we use today. So next time you go to fill up your car, you can now say that you know where that fuel came from. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed.